Rachel, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited about presenting to the Shimasu audience today and look forward to your questions on the back end. I will be talking about data that I have collected in my research lab. And so when I say I collected, it's really, I have a really great research team who's done the bulk of this research, and I'm really fortunate to be able to lead a group of really fantastic folks in this endeavor. So I'll be reporting on our systematic analysis, and I'll be talking about some of the things that we've discovered in my laboratory. Before I get started, I do need to recognize that all of the opinions that I am about to state are mine, and not those of the National Institute of Justice or the Office of Justice Programs. I am very fortunate to have been funded since 2014, and I will be talking about my current research endeavors on the 2018 and 2019 grants. And so I am very thankful that the National Institute of Justice took a chance on what I thought was a crazy project in 2013, because electronic cigarettes had not really become fantastically popular as what we have seen them in recent years. And so when I pitched to them that electronic cigarettes might be used for inhaling other kinds of pharmacologically active ingredients, I'm really thankful that the NIJ wanted to allow me to explore that. Most people don't recognize that the electronic cigarette has actually been around for decades in the United States. The first electronic cigarette was invented in 1927 and patented in 1930. Interestingly enough, it was not for the purposes of inhaling nicotine. It was invented for the purpose of inhaling tinctures that could be used for alleviating different maladies. Fast forward to the mid-60s, Big Tobacco created versions of the electronic cigarette that never became commercially popular. And there are a couple of reasons as to why that was the case. The first reason, for those of us that are either old enough to remember or old enough to know somebody who tried these, is that the device that was invented in the mid-60s was very difficult to use and wasn't very effective at delivering nicotine. The second reason in the mid-60s that the e-cigarette didn't become popular was because smoking a traditional cigarette was still kind of cool. And so then therefore the electronic cigarette was not commercially successful in the 60s. So if you fast forward to the early aughts, the modern electronic cigarette was invented in 2003 by Han Lik in China. And so his father had died from lung cancer from smoking, and he was also a heavy smoker. And he explains that he was having a nightmare and felt as though he was drowning, but emerged through a cloud with the idea of the modern electronic cigarette. When you take a look at the patents between his cigarette from 2003 and the 1927 patent, they are remarkably quite similar. So after Han Lik invented this device and he sold the patent, and it began to be mass-produced, it spread through Europe and Australia and landed in the United States in 2007 in the Tobacco Expo in Las Vegas, where it won an award for being an innovative product. Shortly thereafter, several Chinese companies tried to import thousands of electronic cigarettes into the United States. However, they were stopped at the docks by the Food and Drug Administration. The FDA had said, those cannot be distributed into the United States. We regulate tobacco here, and those are not approved products. The Chinese companies really were very clever in their language that they used to fight this. They said that the Food and Drug Administration does not oversee the electronic cigarette because it is not using tobacco products. The electronic cigarette is a nicotine delivery device. And so then, therefore, the FDA could not oversee or regulate those products. So the Chinese company sued the FDA and won in court with that very argument. So then it took the FDA roughly 9 years to figure out what regulatory language they needed to erect to be able to control the electronic cigarette. In the process, they swooped in several other products that are used for nicotine delivery that had also not been regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. So in May of 2016, the FDA ruled that the manufactured packaging, import, labeling, advertising, promotion, sale, and distribution was going to be regulated. In May of 2016, there were some regulations that immediately went into effect, and these were things like banning the sales of electronic cigarettes to minors. However, what had happened in that 9-year gap that the Food and Drug Administration was deciding on the regulatory language, several states, actually most states by 2016, had developed legislation that controlled electronic cigarettes, because it was true that a child could walk into a convenience store and buy electronic cigarettes and their e-liquids. So there were a number of regulations that went into place at the state level. So banning the sale to minors and controlling where people could vape followed suit with where they could smoke a traditional cigarette. So other kinds of regulations that were going to take longer to put into place had longer deadlines. So the next compliance deadline for these regulations was December 2018. And these were really regulations that would support public safety and really push for transparency in products. So December of 2018 came and went, and the FDA decided to extend the deadline to 2022. And one reason for that was because they decided that the electronic cigarette could become their mitigated risk strategy, believing that the e-cigarette was going to be a safer product than a traditional tobacco cigarette. After the Food and Drug Administration extended the deadline to December 2022 for companies to become compliant regarding regulations that really promulgated public health and public safety, they were sued by some anti-tobacco groups saying that it was really inappropriate for the FDA to push the deadline for the regulations back. A United States federal judge agreed with them and ordered the Food and Drug Administration in July of 2019 to make the deadline for the regulations within 10 months. The current status for FDA regulations on electronic cigarettes and the e-liquids is that anybody who was manufacturing and distributing electronic cigarettes needed to apply for a pre-market tobacco product. And so essentially this application describes what devices are going to be sold and what are the constituents of the e-liquids. The deadline for that compliance was June of 2020, and it got pushed to September of 2020. And that has stuck. That has come and gone. And everybody who was supposed to have applied needed to apply by September. The current situation is that there is an open comment period, and this is to evaluate what priorities need to be introduced for enforcement. And so the question is, for those who did not put in their application for the pre-market tobacco products, what penalties are going to be put in place for those? And so that is still an open comment period. So you might be asking yourself, why is she spending so much time talking about e-cigarette regulations? And I'm going to share with you a couple of reasons why I think this is the case. One reason why I think it's important to have an appreciation for regulations and the pacing for developing regulations is what happens with consumer transparency. And so you see a little bit of data here that is from a company that owns some big tobacco. And so what's interesting is that the companies, big tobacco, knew, much like they did with the traditional cigarette, they knew what chemicals and chemical byproducts were going to be, that were in the e-liquids or that were going to be generated through the process of aerosolization. So big tobacco knew. And so you'll see here that they see that, formulations and actually have some heavy metals in them. There are some tobacco-specific nitrosamines and ammonia and other nicotine-related chemicals. And in the aerosols, that there is production of formaldehyde and benzene and isoprene. So so big tobacco has long known, and so they published that there were going to be byproduct chemicals. However, what they stated was that most constituents investigated in this study were not detectable or were well below the limit of quantities in the products in the study. So what's interesting about the data that they produced is that, they only looked at, a couple of different devices, and they were devices that because the electronic cigarette industry evolved so quickly, the devices they evaluate were not relevant for very long. But what wound up happening was that the e-cigarette industry really clung to this kind of data that said, yes, we know that there's going to be these chemicals, but they're below the limit of quantitation of the instrumentation, and so it's really not all that significant. And so it was this kind of data that really led towards people believing that they were going to be safer products. One term that the e-cigarette industry really not just clung to, but they promulgated, was that the chemicals that were being used in e-liquids was what the FDA considers generally recognized as safe. And that would include chemicals such as propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin, some, if not all, flavoring agents. And so while these products are designated, these chemicals are designated as GRAS chemicals, GRAS is a designation for chemicals that are meant to be ingested and meant to be consumed orally. They are not considered GRAS for inhalation. And so this is the beginning of our problem with electronic cigarettes. Another consideration for why it is important to be concerned about the regulatory framework at the federal level that provides oversight to products in terms of consumer protections is that big gap, particularly for e-cigarettes, that was 9 years at the minimum to 12 years for the current pre-market application. That span of time gives ample time to allow for the products to evolve, the e-liquids to become more complicated in their chemical nature, and for the devices to be leveraged for other purposes. And so I want to draw your attention to this study that came out of North Carolina. It was published in 2019. And so what I'm going to distill this down to is that there was an evaluation amongst high school kids with regards to their propensity to vape cannabis. And so when you evaluate the question, if you smoke a traditional cigarette, what is the chance that you'll vape cannabis? And that was a 28% increase And then if they were to actually vape nicotine, then you'll see that there was a much higher chance that they would actually vape cannabis as well. So if we go back to the summer of 2019, having an appreciation that we have known that the cannabis industry has essentially co-opted the electronic cigarette. Summer 2019 is where we first saw young people who were being hospitalized and also dying from developing these severe lung injuries from vaping. And so the CDC began, of course, monitoring this, and there was a lot of concern about what are these people actually vaping. And so this is why it's important to have at least some understanding as to what happens in the gap without regulatory oversight. The CDC actually stopped collecting this data in February of 2020. And at the end of their cataloging of the data, there were more than 2,800 hospitalizations and 68 deaths. And by no means was it a young person-only phenomenon. You see here the age range of victims was up to 75 years old. And so even though the CDC has stopped collecting data with regards to EVALI, that doesn't mean it is necessarily stopped nationwide. The Association for Public Health Laboratories has continued to collect data with regards to people being hospitalized for lung damage due to vaping. And so what they have actually been able to catalog is that while the FDA and the CDC attributed these early injuries and deaths to vitamin E and vitamin E acetate in what I would consider more the gray market for the cannabis industry, it's now no longer vitamin E or vitamin E acetate. It's moved on to other chemicals, and I'm going to talk about those chemicals when I show you the list of chemicals we found in my research lab. One question that I am frequently asked is, well, how did we get here? We thought we learned our lesson with nicotine. How did we get into this space? And so it's by some a convoluted story. By others, it's fairly straightforward and not surprising as to how we got here. It's really hard to know when the very first vapes containing THC appeared. We had been dealing in the controlled substances industry with clever THC products such as waxes and dabs, highly concentrated products. And so there is some attribution that somewhere around 2009, 2010, there were some homemade concoctions for e-liquids with THC. Granco Science is the first company to manufacture commercial THC vapes. The owner of Granco Science is Chris Folkerts, and he claims that he took a hit of a homemade THC vape in 2010 and said, "This just digitized weed," even though he claims that it really didn't get him high. He began making THC vapes that were small and pen-like for discreet use and sold them out of the trunk of his car. He then founded Granco Science in 2012, and it is now the home of the popular G-Pen and Snoop Dogg's line of THC vapes. In 2015, the health section of the New York Times wrote an article called "No Smoke But Haze Around E-Joint." And so a lot of companies in the cannabis industry really grabbed on to what was stated in the New York Times, that the device, called the Juju joint, heralds a union that seems all but inevitable, marijuana and the e-cigarette together at last. And so this statement really does mark a point in time and herald that the co-opting of the e-cigarette by the cannabis industry was sure to happen. So let's get back to really talking about the e-cigarette in terms of nicotine. But before I get there, I'm going to talk about the THC vape one more time, and this is a more complicated story in some regards. So PAX is a widely popular brand of THC vapes. It was born in 2015. There are multiple stories about the formation of PAX Labs and the pod mod we know as Juul. According to PAX Labs' own site, the PAX company was spun out of Juul in 2017. According to CNBC, the opposite is true. Either way, the founding of the company was in 2015. You may ask, why is it important to be definitive about this? Because attribution of the pod mod is important. While it may not reverse the course, it does help us to understand how we got here when people wonder just that. So it really underscores the value of the expediency of the regulatory guidelines of developing oversight for an industry, even if it's tiered, because it begins to make demands of manufacturers to protect public health and public safety. So, which is so important when new products are hitting the market. The unregulated cannabis industry co-opted the unregulated e-cigarette, and many have given credit to the electronic cigarette as removing the stigma for marijuana and helping to drive the legalization efforts. Folkerts, the owner of Granco Science and the home of the popular THC vape called Snoop Dogg, said the pre-dosed, self-contained systems are viewed as more medicinal. Even Folkert says, if you go in the corner and light a pipe, it could be crack, right? But it could be crack in a G-pen. It's totally crooked. In the end, the lack of regulations also facilitated the adoption of nicotine salts, or nic salts, which allow for extremely high concentrations of nicotine in the pods, which in turn facilitated the meteoric rise of the concealable, discrete use pod mod, the Juul, in 2015. So you'll note that the nicotine pod mod and the THC vape both use the terms concealable, discrete use. So let's unpack. What are these devices? What's the evolution of these devices? And what's in an e-liquid? The first device, the first generation device, and the one that really came to the United States in 2007, is one that looks like a cigarette. It has a really simple composition. It's got a battery coil. It's low single voltage. It only has a small volume of e-liquid in it. And it turns out that it just fed the desire of people who wanted to vape to consume their nicotine. Consumers very quickly wanted more options. They wanted to be able to load the e-cigarette with their own liquid. They wanted to put more liquid into the e-cigarette. They wanted to be able to recharge their own devices that had a battery in them. So such was born the second generation, or what some refer to as the pen-like model. This very quickly gave rise to what's considered the advanced personal vaporizer. The advanced personal vaporizer has very large batteries on them that allows the user to change the power setting for the purposes of generating larger clouds or putting more drug into the aerosol itself. And it also allows the user to build their own rig, to wind their own coils. And so what we see here is an adaptation of the third generation device. And so this is really the pathway to a next generation that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on. But what we see here is that people who wanted to vape other pharmaceutical products, drugs other than nicotine, they would unscrew the mouthpiece from the e-cigarette, drop that drug directly onto the hot coils, and then hit the power button, heat all of that up, and create the aerosol. And so sometimes the user would put the mouthpiece back onto the device, but oftentimes they would just use a straw to inhale the aerosol from this position. So this was the third generation device, the Advanced Personal Vaporizer. The Advanced Personal Vaporizer really gave way to what that my lab coined as the fourth generation product, or the alternative vaping products. And so the CDC, just to be clear, does not recognize this as its own generation. But because of the nature of what we do, we think it's really important to call out this specific generation. So the fourth generation really took the Advanced Personal Vaporizer, as we see above, and said, why do we need to unscrew the mouthpiece to drop the e-liquid through there? So they just expanded the bore size of the mouthpiece so that users could drop their e-liquid that has a different pharmaceutical in it straight onto the coils without unscrewing the mouthpiece. Other products in this generation are things like metal cups and ceramic rods, or these bowls for herbal products. And so, again, we call these the alternative vaping products because their purpose is really for vaping other products than e-liquids with nicotine. The fifth generation of the electronic cigarette, again, the CDC refers to this as the fourth generation, is really characterized by what is referred to as the pod mod. And this really became popular with the products called Juul. And so, Juul has had some difficult times in recent years, and so what has happened, though, is that a number of other companies have also become very successful. But the hallmark of this generation of a device is that they are concealable and they're small. They often look like something else. The amount of e-liquid that is used in these products is very small compared to the other devices. So typically the volume of an e-liquid in these devices is anywhere from 0.5 ml to 1 ml. And so you should ask yourself, well then, what kind of hit of nicotine are you going to get from just that small volume? Well, the answer is a lot, because this technology actually leverages what the big tobacco has known for generation as a very effective way to increase nicotine in products, and that is with the chemical known as a nicotine salt, or the nic salt. One of the attributes about the pod mod that is particularly confounding to middle school teachers, high school teachers, and parents is that because the pod mod allows for small volumes of e-liquid, devices can be small and easily concealable, is that the devices now take all kinds of configurations. So you see here that there is an e-cigarette that is actually on the tip of a hoodie string. There's an e-cigarette that looks like a smartwatch or an asthma inhaler or an ink pen or a key fob. And so again, these it's really taking the concealable attribution to the next level. So in the e-cigarettes that are really generations 1, 2, and 3, the e-liquid is made with what is referred to as the free-base nicotine. However, and again, the pod mods take advantage of nicotine salt chemistry, which allows the devices to get very small because less liquid is required. So the nicotine salt formulation is where the nicotine molecule is combined with some kind of organic acid. One of the more common organic acids that's used to make the nic salt is benzoic acid. And so what happens when the formulations are made with nic salt is that the burn that happens in the mouth or the back of the throat that is really acerbic with free-base nicotine is dramatically reduced with the nicotine salt formulation. So because that sting that happens with free-base nicotine is diminished, then the manufacturers can pack more nic salts into smaller volumes. So what you see on the right is nicotine concentration of a number of different pod mod formulations. So the Juul fluid e-liquid is really the one we're going to make the comparison to. It's not uncommon to see the nicotine concentration in Juuls upwards of around 50 milligrams per mil. And the normal e-liquid that's made with a nicotine-free base is somewhere in the vicinity of 8 to 20 milligrams per milliliter. So when we have a pod mod, that nicotine salt allows for, in a single pod, 55 to 65 milligrams of nicotine, which is much more nicotine that's even in an entire pack of cigarettes. So what does the formulation of an e-liquid look like? Typically what makes up the most of an e-liquid is what is known as the humectant, or the thing that makes the cloud, the chemical that makes the cloud. And most e-liquids are comprised of either propylene glycol or vegetable glycerin, or some ratio of the two combined. Of course, there are lots of flavoring chemicals to be used. I think last tabulation was that there were somewhere on the order of 7,000 different flavoring profiles that could be used. Of course, any given flavorant could be made up of a number of different chemicals. And then, of course, there's the active ingredient. And so, of course, we understand nicotine, but my lab focuses on what I refer to as the .Ns, drugs other than nicotine. And so at the top of that list, and that we find is, besides THC, the most common drug that's not nicotine is ethanol. And ethanol is an unlabeled ingredient by and large. And I'm going to talk about the issues around ethanol being in e-liquids in a little bit. We know that natural products and plant materials are used, and so this isn't just about cannabis products. We also know that other herbal materials like kratom or Chinese herbal remedies are also used in vaping materials, and I'll show you some of our research around that. We refer to non-traditional pharmaceuticals. This is really things like caffeine or melatonin or vitamins that are used in e-liquids, and then of course scheduled drugs and designer drugs. And I'll show you some examples of those in a few slides. So I'm really fortunate in my laboratory to have a number of instruments placed and that I have easy access to for the pursuit of our research projects. And so we're able to set up a number of analytical processes in the lab, depending on what we suspect is the pharmacologically active ingredient, to what kind of material is it, and of course, you know, what are our sensitivity issues. And so what we've done is we've set up essentially this scheme in the lab. So when we get an unknown chemical in the lab, we first run it through our direct analysis in real-time time-of-flight mass spectrometer. We use this instrument as a form of general chemical profile screening so that we have potentially some idea as to what is present. When we want to confirm the pharmacologically active ingredient and any other chemical constituents in any of the products, we rely either on the Shimatsu LC MMS 8050 or the Shimatsu GCMS QP2020. And when we want to analyze for volatiles, and of course we're looking for ethanol, but because we're concerned about other solvents that could be used to extract pharmacologically active ingredients to put into these formulations, we look at an array of common volatiles, So we're looking at not just ethanol, but isopropanol and methanol as well. So we've got 5 volatiles in our assay, and we use Shimatsu's Headspace 20 GCFID. It's a dual column. And then we also evaluate the glycol composition. And so we put a Stabilowax column into our GCMS QP 2020. This data is from the very first manuscript that we published, where I really got tuned into issues with regards to the lack of federal oversight. And so our very first manuscript that was published in 2016 was evaluating the chemical constituents in these e-liquids. And so we looked at just e-liquids purchased in the United States. All of the manuscripts at the time were evaluating e-liquids abroad. And so what we found here was an evaluation of 27 e-liquids purchased across the United States was that only a few of them got close to the labeled content. And so we thought that was personally fairly egregious. What you see in the spectra in the top right is what an early DART spectra looks like. And so you see that chemical makeup is fairly straightforward. And what you're going to see in subsequent slides is that the formulation seems to have gotten a lot more complicated. And then there in the lower right-hand corner is our glycol analysis. So we use 1,4-butane-diol as our internal standard. And so this data goes hand in hand with the nicotine data that's in the blue chart. And so what we see here is that 6 products that we purchased weren't labeled, and 4 of those products were more than 10% off of what they claimed. And so what we did here was we just borrowed the Food and Drug Administration's method for analyzing glycols in toothpaste. This data did not get published in our very first study. We had a situation arise in the lab where we became suspicious that a product had ethanol in it. And so after we confirmed that it did, we then backtracked and analyzed all of the e-liquids in the lab at the time. And I think at the time there was somewhere in the order of 65 e-liquids in the lab. And what we see here, not surprisingly, there are trace amounts of ethanol in e-liquids, but what we were really confounded by was that 11 products that we had randomly purchased across the United States had more than 10% ethanol in them. E-liquids that we have evaluated in recent years, we've seen as high as 30% ethanol. Not to spend a lot of time talking about metals, but one of the first projects we started in 2014, you'll see this data didn't get published until 2020 just because it took us a long time to assemble all of the data, was that we actually demonstrated the deterioration of that coil as it is heated in the electronic cigarette. And you'll see by 150 heat cycles, we have pretty significant deterioration of the coil. And so what we know is that this metal is in the aerosol being inhaled by the user. One thing that has become a little disconcerting for my research lab is that when e-liquids contain cannabinoids, the manufacturers are considering other kinds of carriers or humectants to help dissolve the cannabinoids into the e-liquids that are still PG and or VG. And so we've seen that some companies are using PEG and some are using MCTs or medium chain triglycerides. And again, we understand and know that these 2 chemicals are considered GRAS chemicals, but again, not for inhalation. They are not safe for inhalation purposes. So this is a short list of chemicals that we have found in e-liquids in my laboratory. We have identified at least 267 different chemicals. We have recognized that the composition of e-liquids have gotten more complicated, and that we have seen the e-liquids evolve with device capabilities as well as introducing other pharmacologically active ingredients. So the list that we have out of the 267 chemicals, there's 124 known irritants to lung tissue, 28 that are designated as health hazards, 9 that are acutely toxic. If you recall, the Association for Public Health Laboratories is still collecting data on patients who are hospitalized with lung injuries from vaping. And so APHL has documented that pine resin and ethanone have been found in the products used by these patients. We have also found menthol as an unlabeled ingredient in e-liquid products. We have some concern that the menthol is being added because it facilitates addiction to nicotine because it allows the inhaler to inhale more deeply without having a harsh reaction. I'm going to share with you here a little bit of some unpublished data. We're in the process of pulling together this manuscript, and we were deeply concerned when we evaluated some Juul products in our laboratory that was going to be used in a clinic. We found GBL in the tobacco flavored Juul products. And after evaluating a number of different batches of Juul tobacco products, we found that this was consistent. Even though the pod mods are small and contain small volumes of ethanol, we are seeing some that are as much as 20% ethanol as well, also unpublished, and we're working on this manuscript too. So now I'm going to take a little bit of time to share with you some very specific cases and situations that, that we have seen arise in my laboratory. So in 2014, somebody reached out to my laboratory and said, is it possible that THC is being put into e-cigarettes? And we said, seems reasonable to us. Remember, this is before the New York Times said that this was inevitable. So we received this product in my research laboratory, not knowing what we were about to receive. This is the product we received in my lab. It's a Liberty Reach product, and if you could see the details on the package label, it is from the very first batch produced by this company, and the e-liquid comes in a syringe, and you can see it is this dark brown, sort of opaque in nature e-liquid. So remember, the first analysis in my laboratory is time-of-flight mass spectrometry. And what we see here is a range of cannabinoids, some chemicals that we weren't sure what they were, and then propylene glycol. We suspected that those chemicals in that region of the time-of-flight mass spectra were the terpenes. And so when we ran the e-liquid through our GCMS, and we saw this really nice profile of terpenes that come directly from the plant material, and we were able to confirm these with their standards. At the end of the day, we actually quantitated that the e-liquid was 42.6% THC, even though the label said it was 69.1, and then again we were able to confirm an array of cannabinoids. So what we have an appreciation for is that the plant material itself was extracted to produce the e-liquid. What we have also come to appreciate about this product is that in the early days of manufacturing these e-liquids, the cannabis companies were not cleaning out the terpenes, which is why it is, has this brown color to the e-liquid itself. It's because they've not cleaned the terpenes out. Since then, the cannabis industry has gotten clever and has been able to do a cleanup step to remove the terpenes, which then makes the product look a little more clear. In the early days, because they just extracted the plant material and didn't do a lot of cleanup on it as well, of course we see the array of cannabinoids that were also extracted from the plant material. And here again we see the terpene profile. What I want to point out to you is how conceivably how simple this chemical formulation is compared to what we have found in recent years. Now this Liberty Reach product is made by a different company entirely. However, what you see here is that the chromatogram and the spectra of this cannabis formulation is much more complicated than what the early days of the formulations are. One of the things that we have noted is just how egregious some of the lack of labeling is for products made inside the cannabis industry that is not regulated very well. And so in this product, the label says that there's no VG, PG, PEG, or MCTs, and of course what we found was contrary. Here we also evaluated cannabidiol formulations or CBD formulations and found the same challenges with the disparity between what was actually in the label, in the bottle versus what was on the label. This manuscript, published in JAMA, actually confirms that the inaccuracy of labeling, or maybe the inability for the industry to accurately quantitate cannabinoids in their products, is very widespread. So you'll see here that 84 products were evaluated in this manuscript, and they found that 26% were over-labeled. So not long after CBD e-liquid formulations hit the market, it wasn't long before people started complaining about having unintended consequences, feeling as though they had been poisoned by the CBD products that they were vaping. And so I'm really proud of the work that my research team has done around this. So my laboratory has actually received dozens of samples from individuals nationwide who have claimed and complained and proclaimed that they have consumed a CBD e-liquid or an oil and had some kind of unintended consequence, anything that ranges from, you know, hallucinations to a bad high. So I'm going to start with the very first one that we received in my lab. We received an e-liquid in my laboratory that somebody claimed that they had had a really harsh high with. Not knowing where that person had actually purchased the product, we went directly to the company, not to a secondary distributor. We went directly to the company to buy more of that product. And so what we found was that it contained a synthetic cannabinoid, the 5-fluoro-ADB, and also some of the products contained dextromethorphan, over-the-counter cough syrup. And so that was published in Forensic Science International, and then soon hit the popular media websites. The CEO of the company was actually approached with our data, and so he claims that he went back to the batch that we purchased our products out of and ran an analysis on them and actually found that they didn't contain CBD, but they contained melatonin. So what this company does now to essentially redeem themselves, or at least hope to redeem themselves, is they take random samplings out of all of their batches and send them to a laboratory to be evaluated for a number of synthetic cannabinoids. And so what's interesting about this analyte list is that it doesn't actually contain 5-fluoro-ADB or dextromethorphan, and yet people continue to complain about having adverse reactions when using products from this manufacturer. These are actually products that we have received in our laboratory from consumers who say they've had some kind of adverse reaction. And so what you see is that these don't look like they would be what would be black market or gray market products. They actually look like fairly high-end products. So the products are either purchased in online or brick-and-mortar stores, and you'll see victim quotes there from hard high to schizophrenic episode to dissociating from reality. Some of the products had CBD in them, some of them did not. Most of them had synthetic cannabinoids in them, and one only had THC in it, and that person described a schizophrenic episode. So this is a product that I showed you previously, the Liberty Reach product that has a really messy chromatogram on it. So we were really interested in what could be in the chromatogram underneath all of that mess in the red box. So we went back to our time-of-flight mass spectrometer to do a little bit more work to try to figure out what could have possibly been in that GCMS data. And so you'll see here we've got a number of suspicious peaks. And the attribution of the protonated ion is difficult. So you'll see that at 327.203, that could be 4 potential compounds, et cetera, et cetera. So are we interested in absolutely identifying these? Quite honestly, we're not. This is a product that a consumer used, and this is adequate evidence that it doesn't just contain CBD. One of the things that we do as a matter of practice in my research lab is that we're constantly looking online for products that seem unusual. One of the cues is that if a product is really expensive, like more than $15 or $20, we've certainly seen products be $50, $70, $150, some products $1,000. So we bought this product called Bizarro, and its ingredient list says it has wild dogga. So we're interested. Does it just have wild dogga in it? And what is wild dogga? So this is the bottle that we received, and when we evaluate what is clip dogga or wild dogga, we learned that it is actually a plant that is used as a marijuana substitute, and that potentially the active ingredient that creates that is something called leonurine. We learned that there's actually quite a large enterprise in creating herbal remedies for the e-cigarette industry. And so this is somebody that we follow fairly regularly and purchase their products online to see how true they hold. So this is one of the products that we received. It's advertised as something that will blow your mind, and we discovered that it had apomorphine in it and luciferin. By coincidence, not long after we evaluated the Lotus Extracts products, we received a case that came in through the emergency department where somebody was overdosing on a product, and the person's mother actually brought the resin to us. And so we discovered that it has apomorphine and luciferin in it. And so because he vaped it, because there was a highly concentrated pharmacologically active ingredient in this product, he overdosed on it, and fortunately the young man survived. From Lotus Extracts, we also purchased Kratom Cup, or Kratom, otherwise known as Kratom, and so we evaluated these against products that I had purchased in a head shop down the street from my office. And that's what these products look like. So I purchased 2 Purple Hazes, 2 King Kratoms. We have really no idea what the 0 and the 12 stand for. We're not sure if it means 0 milligrams of nicotine, 0 milligrams of metragenine. Not very certain, but we did analyze it. One of our concerns about these herbal products is the advice that users are given on how to consume the e-liquids or the oils that they are receiving. And so what you see here is from Speciosa Guide. is that they recommend that if you're used to taking 4 grams of kratom, either in some kind of tea concoction or a pill formulation, you're taking it orally, that you need to smoke 40 grams of it, but you can vape it. And so we do know that that there have been a number of overdose deaths from people vaping kratom. I'm going to return briefly to something I previously talked about with regards to ethanol being in e-liquids. We're oftentimes asked, well, what's the source of ethanol? Why is there ethanol in e-liquid products? The first reason is that some flavoring chemicals are actually dissolved in ethanol. Specifically, vanilla is required by the FDA to be dissolved in a minimum of 35% ethanol. So it's not surprising that we might find trace amounts of ethanol in e-liquid. We also know that there's a lot of advice online for people that, depending on the device that they're using, they might need to thin their e-liquid. So if that's the case, then they are advised to thin it in something like vodka. We also know there's quite a bit of advice online for people looking to dissolve pills or very viscous drug formulations to be able to vape, and so they say just dissolve all of those products into vodka as well to put into your e-liquid. And of course, we also know that there is a product called Vape Shot, which is the intentional inhalation of ethanol from an e-cigarette, and there are also other modalities for intentionally vaping ethanol. Before I close, I want to leave you with a handful of key issues for you to consider. My current research project is going to be evaluating issues from vaping ethanol. The first thing that we're going to be evaluating in our new clinical study is the impact of vaping ethanol on the preliminary and evidentiary breath tests that officers will give to suspected persons for DUI. And so specifically, we're going to be evaluating the wait period that an officer has to wait before somebody is actually given the PBT or the EBT to make sure that the ethanol that is going into the device would be coming from deep lung tissue as opposed to residual ethanol that would be in the mouth. We will be evaluating impairment. We'll be evaluating that through the standardized field sobriety test. We're going to be taking a look at if somebody is vaping ethanol, do the metabolites of ethanol, are those detectable in urine, blood, and oral fluid? We have heard some anecdotal information that people who are vaping ethanol, if they are enrolled in an alcohol recovery program, then they are, the people who vape are more likely to sort of fall off the wagon, so to speak. And certainly what we want to be able to do is collect data so that we're sure that DUI convictions are appropriately attributed. When you take a look at the literature, even while the industry and consumers were saying that it was safe to vape, and I'm not discounting the fact that it could be and likely is safer than smoking a traditional cigarette in some regards. There has been documentation that even in the early days that vaping creates problems for people. Now, when patients show up with these complaints in their doctor's offices, unless the physician is asking the right questions, they might not attribute this symptomology to vaping. So we know that in the literature there has been complaints about nose irritation, red eyes, sore eyes, dry throat, asphyxia. We know that some people have hypersecretion of mucus. We know that there's an inflammatory response. So we know historically, we've known that that vaping isn't a no-risk activity. When you take a look in the literature to really evaluate what causes this kind of lung injury, it actually shouldn't be surprising at all that there is some kind of inflammation or hypersecretion or some kind of an inflammatory response in the deep lung tissue. We know that chemicals are going to disrupt that epithelial layer that is between the alveoli and the capillary bed. And when that epithelium is disrupted, then you're going to get an immune response. Now the question is the vaping, are you getting this low-level immune response, and then suddenly you change products and somebody has a reaction to a chemical in a new product because they've had this baseline injury, or is it going to be a rapid onset? And so that in and of itself is debatable, but the mechanism for damage to the deep lung tissue from chemicals is fairly well understood. I can certainly have some appreciation that we're probably all really tired of hearing about COVID these days. However, I think one thing that needs to be stated again and again is that if people also vape, I know it has been stated that if you are smoke, you are likely more susceptible for developing symptoms of COVID, but that also goes with vaping. Remember, you're developing some kind of injury to that deep lung tissue, and then if you also contract the COVID virus, the coronavirus, then you're more likely to develop that symptomology. With regards to highly concentrated cannabinoid formulations, there must be some word of caution with regards to some potential bad outcomes for constantly consuming highly concentrated cannabinoid products. And so one that we've seen appear in the news and in publications in recent years, particularly as products have become increasingly more concentrated, is something called cannabinoid hyperemesis. And so this is associated with a chronic use of cannabis and certainly high concentrations of cannabis as well. And so it is most typified by people saying that they have a really horrible pain in their gut. As soon as they stop consuming the cannabinoids, the THC, then the symptoms seem to go away. Another issue with regards to vaping cannabinoid products, and really this is about consuming a lot of CBD products, but particularly in consuming CBD vaping products, is that the CBD likely contains low concentrations of THC, very low concentrations of THC. Some CBD products actually have more in there, more THC in them than they say they do. At the end of the day, what winds up happening is if somebody is taking a lot of CBD products, then they very well could test positive for THC in a urine drug test. One issue that I advocate for very strongly when I consult with states regarding the legalization of cannabis products is that it is important for them to consider also standing up an adverse event reporting system. The Food and Drug Administration does not will not take complaints from products that they don't regulate. So therefore, because the states are regulating legalized cannabis products, then it behooves them to stand up this adverse reporting system for consumers who do have reactions that they don't anticipate. And one of the reasons I continue to advocate for this in all states that are legalizing cannabis is because we still see quite a few complaints online in drug forums where people are having unintended consequences. And these are largely people who are turning to CBD products and THC products because they're searching for an authentic solution to remedy whatever it is that ails them. And so because they don't have any other place to turn, then they'll turn to the internet to try to find solutions. So an adverse reporting system would be particularly important, especially as states legalize cannabis and these vaping products continue to have high concentrations of cannabinoids in them. Above all, one of the most important aspects, I think, of what my research has enabled me to do is advocate that we have to have transparency in the consumer marketplace. I think it is absolutely critical for consumers to be able to make informed decisions about what they consume. And so in an unregulated industry, there is no consumer protection. There is no consumer advocacy. And so these industries are allowed to proliferate and potentially create dangerous products without consumers knowing it. And so I think the effort takes a collaborative, multidisciplinary approach to the research, and that we need to have evidence-based interventions and scientifically based regulations. So I do want to thank you for your time. I really appreciate that you have joined us today. I would like to thank my lab team. Without their investment and their commitment to the scientific endeavor, I wouldn't be able to do what it is that I do. And so I have a very large research team every semester, and I have a number of really fantastic collaborators that I work with across the university campus. And so I would certainly like to say thanks to them for allowing me to do this. I would also like to thank Dr. Rachel Lieberman for inviting me for your extravaganza, and for certainly Shimatsu for inviting me as well, and for all of the work that they do to help me pursue my research goals. And you'll see there my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me. The QR code is a link to my research and lab team blog. So again, thank you for your attention, and I will take any questions that you have.
Fascinating. Let's thank Dr. Michelle Peace for such an exciting presentation. Also, wanted to thank you guys for attending our Analytical Extravaganza webinar series, and don't forget to register for any of the upcoming webinars as shown here with this link on the slide. If you've not had a chance, please fill out the survey questions on the right-hand side to provide any additional feedback and request additional information. Now, at this time, we will begin our live Q&A session. Thank you for sending your questions, and we will get started. All right, Michelle. So our first question that we have is this cannabis data that you showed in the presentation today was geared towards the gray and black market. Have you done any work with medical cannabis or hemp? And if so, what have you seen?
That's a really great question, Rachel, and I really appreciate that. To point out that, yes, we did look predominantly at the gray and the black market products. And that's really because of the nature of the funding and also the evolution of the cannabis industry. So we have looked at products that could be considered medical marijuana products, but pretty much just looking at them from the perspective of what the industry refers to as potency, which is really about evaluating the concentrations of the cannabinoids. And if we've recognized anything inside that industry, it is that the quality assurance laboratories, the third-party independent laboratories. Their results can be fairly divergent from the actual concentration, and so that isn't necessarily to be critical of the laboratories themselves. I think what it speaks to is the complication of just product analysis, generally speaking. I think that there's some really good research happening that's evaluating extraction protocols for cannabinoids from medibles and certainly e-liquids and all other kinds of medical marijuana products that shows that depending on your extraction process, you could get anywhere from 3% to 70% of the cannabinoids out of the product. So I think some of the challenge for the medical marijuana industry really is with regards to making sure that there is a proficiency testing system in place for those companies. Otherwise, for the medical marijuana industry, we look for, as you can tell from our program, all kinds of different compounds. So we've not found anything other than what we were really, quote unquote, supposed to. It's just the challenges, the quantitation for THC.
Okay, that's great. Definitely a lot of work to look in there. So one question, because a lot of these newer products and consumers are kind of showing those iPhone-looking e-cigarettes and e-liquids. Is there an actual age limit to these? And could someone that's a child be able to purchase these?
The states, prior to the FDA's regulations being put into place in May of 2016, prior to that, all states had stood up legislation prohibiting the sales of e-cigarettes and e-cigarette type products to minors, and states essentially landed on what was the legal limit to buy tobacco-based products. So, and then when the FDA stood up their regulations in May of 2016, that was also affirmed in the federal regulation as well. The challenge with these products is that they are exceptionally easy to get. And so because there are some products that are sold in convenience stores that are sort of outside of the stream of big tobacco. They're products that are of more questionable quality. And so young people getting access to these is actually fairly easy, just like with tobacco products and alcohol and beer, and kids are going to find a way when they find a way. And so we have a really interesting project right now where we are evaluating these products that have been confiscated in middle schools and high schools, and we're about to release the data from that. So you're right, a lot of kids still have access to these, because concealment is the name of the game for these products that are using the pod mod systems.
Okay, great. So the next question, and this might tie in a little bit to what you had with your first question, is have you had a chance to look at any pesticides in e-juice, such as like mycobutanol, some of the terpenes that are derived from plant sources that are non-cannabis and have been shown to contain pesticides?
Yeah, great question. So we have, several years ago, we looked at pesticides in e-liquids, but didn't find any. And so it was, I hate to say it in this capacity, but it was sort of a project that we abandoned because some of the nature of what we do for the National Institute of Justice really wasn't supposed to go down this path. But, we think that, maybe in our screening programs, we might be able to pick up some pesticides. But, if we see any terpenes now in more modern products, it's actually a little bit of a surprise to us because it seems like Quite a few manufacturers are removing the terpenes from products, but again, it's not anything we've really focused on here in recent years.
Okay. Well, maybe that might change coming up. And that ties into this next question that I have. And do you see what, obviously you've done a lot of work with this, and you're talking about some of the newer drugs that you're seeing. Do you have a prediction what the next toxin might be that you might find in these e-liquids? And have you found a brand or product that you might consider safer than any of the others?
All right, so let's tackle the first question. So we're regularly on one of the projects that I have. I usually give this to an undergraduate student because, that they're very savvy about, chasing down conversations in forums like Reddit. So we actually keep an eye on drug forums, from Blue Light to Reddit, to some social media accounts as well, where we're trying to get some kind of idea as to what pharmacologically active ingredients people are putting into vapes. And so if they can get a hold of it in a pill formation, they're going to try it, is what it feels like. We also know that NPSs, novel psychoactive substances, are also commonly put into e-cigarettes, and so that's in and of itself really hard to chase, so it's never a surprise to us. There was just a manuscript published out of the University of Mississippi where they had done a survey of products in shops around the state of Mississippi and found synthetic cannabinoids, and synthetic cannabinoids that we haven't found in products in Mississippi. So it really behooves anybody who's doing these chemical analyses to survey products that are purchased to make sure that they're doing some kind of untargeted analysis. The second question around products that are safer than others, the short answer is no. I think that, there has to be an appreciation of, the PG and VG are going to create breakdown products and other chemicals. The flavoring chemicals also have breakdown products themselves. There are solvents that are used in them. One of the things that, it was on one of my slides, but I didn't mention it, was, that there are additives and preservatives that are added to the e-liquids now that's complicating the formulations. And so without adequate oversight of what all of those ingredients could be, should be, then the consumers don't know. And those are still chemicals that are hitting the alveoli that's going to be able to create damage. And so the question always is, well, how much damage is it going to create, and is that additive? And so I think at the end of the day, it's just consumers need to be fully aware of what it is that they're inhaling. And if they choose to want to continue to vape because they like to consume nicotine, then they should know what they're consuming in due course. So so that's why I think that transparency around these products is really one of the most critical pieces in terms of our regulatory process.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. And I believe at this time we are at the end of our allotted time for this webinar. So I want to thank everyone for these interesting questions. And if we were unable to answer your questions today, we will be sure to reach out individually and be able to send you a message for that. So thank you for attending and participating. Please, if you're interested, we still have 10 more webinars as a part of our Analytical Extravaganza webinar series. And you can use the link on the slide to sign up and read about all the bios. And so you will also get a email with the recording of this presentation that you can watch on demand. I want to thank our speaker again, Michelle, for such great information. It's always great to have you and to get to hear your perspective on this in public health. And we look forward to seeing you guys soon. So have a great day, and thank you.